Hello, I'm William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, and in this video I'd like to provide students with some help making their way for the first time through Aristotle's work on interpretation. This is the second work in Aristotle's Organon, and it's assumed that students beginning this study and watching this video have already studied Aristotle's categories. So before we get started with Chapter 1, let's just take a moment and review what we studied in the categories and what we're now going to get into on interpretation and what follows. So Aristotle is here in the Organon, this collection of books that Aristotle wrote, which contain the science and art of reasoning. First, in the categories, he treated of simple ideas. And by simple ideas, we mean conceptions in the mind that cannot be true or false. Simple names of things, simple ideas. In this second book on interpretation, Aristotle considers propositions or judgments. I think it's better to understand the concept of judgment as an operation of the mind. Through judgment, the mind joins or disjoins, joins or divides, combines or divides. There's a number of different ways we can express the idea. The mind joins or divides different ideas by use of the verb is or is not. So when we say man is a creature, by using the verb is, which is called a copula, and joining these two ideas together, that judgment is either true or false. Likewise, if we divide them by saying man is not a creature, we, through that division, make a statement that's either true or false. And in Aristotle's teaching, this is called an interpretation. Okay, so an interpretation is a judgment, a statement that is either true or false. And there are many statements we can make, many sentences, which are not true or false, which cannot be true or false. For example, a question can neither be true nor false. A command is neither true nor false. A wish or prayer is neither true nor false. The only kind of statement that can be true or false is a judgment, which Aristotle refers to in translation here as an enunciative statement. Okay? So in this second book on interpretation, we're going to study enunciative speech or judgments. All right? And then in the next book, in prior analytics, we're going to move from judgments to the formation of arguments, where judgments are joined together, which lead to conclusions which are either true or false. And so the first book on the categories, we have the study and classification of the simple conceptions or ideas of the mind. In the second book on interpretation, we have the study of that act or operation of the mind whereby simple ideas are joined together to form enunciative statements or judgments that are either true or false. And then in analytics, which comes next, we're going to talk about the joining together of judgments or propositions to form syllogisms, which will either be true or false. So this book is getting us ready for analytics, just as the categories got us ready for this book. So let's read through Chapter 1 together, and we'll make sure we understand the content here. Remember, as I always explain to students, the works of Aristotle are to be studied cyclically. And what that means is you cannot pick up at the beginning. You cannot read the categories and understand it, because in order to understand it, you have to first read through Aristotle's works, then come back to the categories, because all of Aristotle's works cyclically inform one another, and that's how they need to be studied because of the way that they were composed. Aristotle did not sit down on day one and write chapter 1 of the categories, and then on day 2 wrote chapter 2 and continued through interpretation and all through the rest of his works on logic. All of these things were being studied and discussed and taught for years and years and years. And finally, he began to write down or present to his disciples the sciences that he had established. And so by that time they were composed, all of the sciences had been informing each other. And that's why we'll see as we go through here that in all of his works he refers to his other works. And it's this big complex network of cross-references going back and forth between works. And it reveals the fact that all of his works interpret all of his works. And that's how we need to study Aristotle, by constantly reading and rereading all of his works and allowing our understanding of them to continually develop in the light of everything else that's been said. Just like reading the sacred scriptures, we need to study Aristotle in the same way. So let's read together chapter 1 of Aristotle's book on interpretation, the second book of the Organon. Let's read together here. And this is the translation of Thomas Taylor, which we use in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. Let's read together chapter 1. In the first place, it is necessary to determine what noun and verb are, and in the next place, what negation, affirmation, enunciation, and a sentence are. So here we have sort of a table of contents, or an outline of what we're going to study in this work on interpretation. It's necessary to determine what a noun and a verb are. And as we know from grammar, these are 2 of the 8 parts of speech. And the number of parts of speech varies between languages and may even vary from one grammar book to another. So when I say there are 8 parts of speech, I'm talking about the classical parts of speech that we study, let's say, in Latin grammar, okay? But of the parts of speech, whether we identify 8 or 9 or 10, as some do in Greek, Aristotle here mentions only 2, the noun and the verb. And the reason why he mentions only 2 is because these 2 alone are necessary for the formation of judgments or propositions. All right? So as we're studying the operation of the mind, which joins ideas together or divides them, joins them by making judgments where we say this is that, using the verb is, and dividing them by saying this is not that, the only parts of speech that are actually necessary for this act of judgment and speaking about these judgments would be a noun and a verb, or nouns and verbs. So those are the only 2 parts of speech that are significant in the study of interpretation. In the next place, what negation, affirmation, enunciation, and a sentence are. So here, after discussing the noun and the verb as the simple parts of judgment or of proposition, we're going to talk about different kinds of propositions: negation, affirmation, enunciation, and the sentence. Okay, so that first sentence is a simple overview of the content of this book. Let's continue reading. Those things, therefore, which are in the voice, spoken things, those things which are in the voice, those things which are spoken, not just ideas, those things which are spoken are symbols of the passions of the soul. Spoken things, spoken words, are symbols or signs of passions of the soul. To understand what he means here, we first need to understand this idea of passions of the soul. It's actually a very simple thing to understand. If we think about the mind, let's think of the mind, and this is just for the sake of illustration. Let's think of the mind as a piece of clay. And all of the things around us, are moving around this ball of clay. And as they move around, they bump into it, as it were. They touch it, and when they touch it, they leave an impression. They leave a mark. And so if we look at this clay after a thing touches it, we'll see an impression in the clay. This idea of this impression is what Aristotle here means by a passion. Something suffered by the clay because something else pressed into it. All right, so if I took, let's say, a leaf, and I pressed a leaf into the clay, and then we looked at the clay, we would see the impression of the leaf in the clay. And Aristotle teaches here that that's how our mind works. Things in the world, things outside the mind, press upon our mind, as it were, by means of our senses. So our senses are constantly receiving this action, this impression from things outside the mind. And all of these things acting upon us through our senses make impressions in our minds. And these impressions are these images that we call ideas or conceptions. Okay? So let's start by understanding what the passions or impressions of the soul are. And then Aristotle says, the things which are in the voice, spoken things, words and judgments, spoken things are symbols of those passions of the soul. Our words are signs or symbols that we use to represent the ideas or the impressions that exist in our mind. Right? It's very simple to understand. Even in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, in our elementary grammar course, we teach this to young children. We teach them that spoken words are signs of ideas. So this is a very simple concept, but a very important concept. Those things which are in the voice are symbols or signs of the passions of the soul or conceptions. This will become clearer as he goes on. Those things which are written, so now we're not talking about those things which are spoken, we're talking about those things which are written words. Written words are symbols of the passions in the voice. Okay, so we have a comparison here that helps us to understand things. When we write with letters, symbols that represent spoken words. Our written words are representations or symbols of our spoken words. That's how we write. Okay, we write letters. The letters represent sounds. Sometimes, if you think about English, we have words in English where the letters really don't directly represent the spoken sounds because English phonics is so confusing. But generally, ideally, the things that we write, the words that we write are symbols of the words that we speak. That's what written words are. Just as written words are symbols of the words we speak, so also the words that we speak are symbols of the conceptions or ideas in our minds, the passions of the soul. All right? Those things which are in the voice are symbols of the passions of the soul. Those things which are written words, are symbols of the passions in the voice. As there are not the same letters among all men, there are not the same letters or written symbols among all men. So if we were to go and look at the Greek language and the English language and the Chinese language, we would easily see that the letters, the written symbols that are used by different people are not the same. The symbols that we use in writing are not the same. And therefore, Aristotle's point here is that they're not natural, but men make them up. We have agreed to use certain symbols to represent certain sounds and certain written words to represent certain spoken words, and that's established by agreement. That's what we see in a dictionary. We go and look at a dictionary to see what word we should use or whether this word represents the right idea, because this is something that we agree upon. That's why we give definitions for words before we begin using them. Most of your studies, the subjects will begin, your textbook will begin by defining the words that it's going to use in the textbook, because the meaning of those words, what those words represent, is determined by men. In the same way, the letters that we use, they differ from one people to another because they're established by institution, it's called. That won't be very helpful to you, but they're established by institution or convention or simply by human agreement. We agree on how we're going to write, and then we're able to communicate to each other in writing because we have agreed on the symbols that we're going to use. Okay? There are not the same letters among all men, so neither are there the same voices or articulate sounds. Just as our writing differs from one person or one group to another, and he's not just saying our handwriting isn't all the same, he's saying our actual symbols are different, just as the symbols that different groups of people use are different alphabets, different written symbols. Just as the symbols we use in writing are different, so neither are there the same voices or articulate sounds. So not only does our writing differ from one group to another, but also the vocal sounds, the words that we use, differ from one group of people to another. So if an English man, a Greek, and a Chinese man were standing together, and a bird flew past, and someone asked, "What was that?" Those three men would use different words to name the same object. So the vocal sounds that men use are not the same. And if they were to write what just flew past, their writing would also not agree. There are not the same letters or written symbols among all men, so neither are the same voices or articulate sounds. The words that different groups use to name things and express ideas are different. And again, the reason why that's important is because it shows us that language is not natural. Language is artificial. It's made by men. It's institutional or conventional. It's established by agreement. Okay? There are not the same letters among all men, so neither are there the same voices or articulate sounds. But listen to this. This is very interesting. The passions of the soul, however, those impressions on our soul that are made by things outside the mind through our senses, the passions of the soul, the ideas themselves, Aristotle says, the passions of the soul, of which these spoken things are signs, the passions of the soul are the same among all men. The passions of the soul are the same among all men. So even though men's writing may be different, even though men's words with different languages may be different, the actual ideas, the actual impressions made by things outside of them upon their souls, those impressions that exist in their minds, they're the same. Isn't that fascinating? To think that an English man, a Greek man, a Spanish man, a Chinese man, may all be standing together and may be completely unable to communicate with spoken or written words, and yet in their minds, the same impressions exist. When the bird flies by and through the sight creates an impression on their soul, in their mind, those men, with all their different languages, have the same idea in their minds. And yet, when they try to communicate it to each other, they're unable to do so because their spoken words and even their written words are different. So while writing and speaking are established by agreement and are artificial, the actual impressions of the soul, the ideas that the world produces in the soul of men, they are the same because they are natural. The ideas in our minds that we receive through our senses, the ideas that we have are natural and they're shared by all men. But the words that we speak and words that we write, they're artificial. They differ among men. But the ideas, the passions of the soul, are the same among all men. I find that to be a fascinating thing to think about. The things of which these are the similitudes are also the same. The things of which these are the similitudes are also the same. That's talking about the objects that actually exist outside the mind in the world. So when that bird flies past, the bird itself is the same for all of those men. The impression on the soul, the conception or the passion of the soul that's received through the senses by those four men is all the same. But the words that they use to signify that impression, whether spoken or written, they will be different. The thing is the same. The passion of the soul, which is a similitude or likeness of that thing, is the same among those men. But their words, spoken and written, will be different. And Aristotle says, concerning these things we have spoken in the treatise on the soul. And so you can see how Aristotle refers to different works. And we might ask, how could Aristotle have established the science of the soul before he taught the art of interpretation here? And the answer is that all of these works are being composed and developed simultaneously, and they're all informing each other. And later, we have sort of this record of what Aristotle taught, which is left for us in these works. But you'll see that that idea of things being the same among all men as regards passions of the soul, he explains this in his treatise on the soul, De Anima in Latin, if you want to give that a read. And he says, these things belong to another discussion. So these are not the subject of this work on interpretation. If you're interested in that subject, go read on the soul. But that's not what we're going to get into here on interpretation. And he goes on to explain what we are going to study on interpretation. He says, as in the soul, a conception, an idea, as in the soul, a conception is at one time without truth. Forgive me as I scroll through this. There's so many notes in this book. Is at one time without truth or falsehood, but at another time it is that in which one of these is necessarily inherent. Thus also it is in the voice or articulate sound. So to look at that again, and again, I'm sorry I have to scroll around. There's so many notes in Taylor's translation. Just bear with me. As in the soul, a conception is at one time without truth or falsehood, but at another time it is that in which truth or falsehood is necessarily inherent, so also it is in the voice or articulate sound. So just as there is truth and falsehood in the mind, there can be, and that's another discussion. If you'd like to learn more about truth, I would recommend you look it up in Aristotle's Ethics. He talks about what truth is. So also in the voice or articulate sound, there can be sometimes truth or falsehood and sometimes not. Let's keep going here. For the false and the true are conversant with composition and division. And this is really the key idea for you to understand here. The false and the true are conversant with composition and division. That word conversant means they have to do with. The false and the true have to deal with or have to do with composition and division. Okay? Now what does that mean? What it means is that ideas by themselves can be true or false. And this is complicated, like I said. This is not the subject of this study. This is a question of how something can be true or false. For example, if we have a name associated with an idea, we can simply name something falsely. Like I could see a mouse walking across the floor, have an idea of that mouse, and name it bird, and that's false. Okay, so we can name something falsely, or we can have a conception in our mind of something that's false. Thomas Aquinas gives an example of this. He says, for example, when people are looking for gold and they find what appears to be gold, and they bring it in thinking that they found gold, and they're told that this is false gold. Well, what does that mean? It means that what it actually is not what they conceive it to be. It's false. Their conception of it, their conception of what this is not what it actually is. When we compose things, what that means is we form judgments, as I mentioned before. We compose things, we join things together. That's what compose means. It means to place together. So we place a subject together with a predicate. We learn this in elementary grammar, right? A subject is that about which we say something, and a predicate is that which we say about the subject. And the copula is the verb that joins the subject and the predicate together. That idea we learn in elementary grammar. That's what Aristotle is referring to here by composition. We join a subject together with a predicate. Two different ideas. We join them together, and we do so with the verb is, or are in the plural, right? And when we join them together, we make a judgment. That's composition. And when we do that, it's either true or false. For example, if I say, the sun is hot, I join sun and hot. I take these two simple ideas and I compose them. I join them together to form a judgment and say, the sun is hot, and that's true. So there's truth there. But if I were to say, the sun is cold, I take this idea of sun and this simple idea of cold, and I join them together in speech or even in my thought by judgment. I join them together, and that judgment is false. So by composition, joining ideas together, we have truth or falsehood. The judgments we make are either true or false. And when we speak those judgments, which is what a proposition is, when we speak those judgments, that proposition is either true or false. When he says division, he means when we deny something. So if I say, the sun is not hot, I take sun and hot, and by, this is kind of confusing, by joining them together with is not, I'm actually dividing them, and I'm saying these two things don't go together. The sun and hot don't go together. I'm dividing them. And the way that I do that is by expressing the judgment. The sun is not hot. That would be false. If I take the sun and cold and I divide them, I say, or I judge, that they are not to be joined. I say the sun is not cold. That statement is true. So sun and cold can be articulated truly if they're divided. Sun and cold would be articulated falsely if they're composed or joined. Sun and hot, if joined, would produce a truth. Sun and cold, if composed, would produce a falsehood. So that's why the false and the true are conversant with composition and division. Composition saying that this is this, and division saying this is not this. When we make that judgment, then we have truth or falsehood. But in sun, there is no truth or falsehood. In cold or hot, there is no truth or falsehood. Unless we join them or divide them, those judgments are true or false. Okay, so for the false and the true are conversant with composition and division. Nouns and verbs, therefore, are assimilated to the conception which is without composition and division. So a noun is a name. It names an idea. It names the conception which is without composition or division, just the idea by itself, without being joined or divided from any other idea. The noun refers to or signifies, is a symbol of, the conception without any judgment being made. And the same is true of a verb. All right? So nouns and verbs are assimilated to the conception which is without composition and division, the separated ideas, such as, for instance, man or white. Man, the idea by itself, the name given to represent that idea by itself cannot be true or false. In the same way, white by itself, without being joined to a subject, cannot be true or false when something is not added, for then it is neither true nor false. Okay, so simple conceptions in the mind, which is what we studied in the categories. What we studied in the categories, the simple conceptions of the mind and their names, they cannot be true or false. And so in the categories, we're not dealing with the operation of the mind that is true or false. But in this book, On Interpretation, we're now moving into the study of the true and the false. Okay, so it is neither true or false, the idea by itself, of which this is an indication that the word tragelaphos signifies something, but not anything true or false. So let me explain what this means, because this is a Greek word and there's no way for you to understand it in English. He says simple ideas by themselves, whether they're names or verbs, cannot be true or false. But when we join ideas together, and we have to join them in a certain way, we have to join them together with is or is not, then as a judgment it becomes true or false. The judgment is true or false, but the separated ideas cannot be true or false, and they have to be joined or divided by means of a verb that connects them together. All right? Now, this word tragelaphos is a fake compound name. What Aristotle does here is he takes the word tragos, which means goat, and elephos, which means a stag or a male deer. And he simply sticks them together to show that this is not what we mean by composition. We don't mean that you just take two nouns and stick them together, like tragelaphos, like goat stag. It doesn't even make any sense. That's not what we mean. The composition that causes something to become true or false is a certain kind of composition. It's not just sticking names together, but sticking certain kinds of names together in a certain way where we produce a judgment, and then that judgment becomes true or false. So tragelaphos is used as an example of the fact that we're not just talking about sticking nouns together and that produces truth or falsehood. It's not that simple. It's a certain kind of composition and division that produces truth and falsehood. It's judgment that produces truth and falsehood. He says, let this be an indication, let this be an example. The word tragelaphos, which is just a simple joining together of two words, signifies something, in the mind at least, but not anything true or false unless to be or not to be. And by to be or not to be, he means the verb is or is not. To be or not to be is added, either simply or according to time. And what he means by simply or according to time is if we say this is that, the verb is the simple form of the verb. This is not that, is not, we're still using a simple or absolute form of the verb. According to time would mean we change the tense or the time of the verb to say was, okay, this was that, or this was not that, or this will be that, or this will not be that. So if we change the tense, well, that adds to the complexity of this. And we'll talk about that later. But tragelaphos, joining together two nouns, does not produce truth or falsehood unless the verb to be or not to be, is or is not, is added to join them. And then that can be done simply by using the present tense of the verb, or according to time, by adding some idea of time other than the present by using a past tense or a future tense form of the verb. So that's chapter 1 of Aristotle's interpretation. Now, I spent a lot of time talking about each point that we looked at. So let's take a minute and just go back over the whole chapter so we can remember what this is about. This is an introduction, and again, forgive me as I scroll through this a little bit. We saw right up front here that Aristotle gave us an outline that we're going to pursue in this work on interpretation. He says, in the first place, it's necessary to determine what noun and verb are. In the next place, what negation, affirmation, enunciation, and a sentence are. So he gives us an outline of this work. And it's to distinguish the work on interpretation, where we're moving to the study of judgments, a different operation of the mind, as opposed to the categories, where we're learning about these impressions of the soul, these passions of the soul, these simple ideas. That's what we learn about in the categories, the simple passions of the soul and the words that are used as signs of them. Here we're moving into judgment. We're moving into the study of negation, affirmation, enunciation, and a sentence. Okay? He then explains how written words, spoken words, the ideas in the mind, and things outside the mind relate to one another. Okay, so there's 4 things in this system of communication and thought, right? There's things that exist, individual things outside the mind, individual things like we studied in Porphyry's introduction, individuals, particular things. These things make impressions on our soul through our senses, and this forms simple ideas, simple notions or conceptions in our mind. That's what we studied in the categories. We then join these things together. Let me say that. We then articulate these things with spoken words, which are signs of these simple conceptions, right? And then we can also write, and when we write, we use symbols, written symbols of the spoken words, which are symbols of the impressions, which are likenesses of the individual real things outside our minds. Okay, so we have a symbol, a written symbol of a spoken word, a spoken symbol of a passion of the soul. The passion soul is not a symbol. The passion of the soul, the idea in our mind, is a likeness or a similitude of the real thing. So we have four things involved in this system of thought and communication. The real individual thing outside the mind, the passion that's made by the impression of that thing upon the soul, the spoken word, which is used as a man-made artificial sign of the idea, and then the written word, which is a man-made artificial sign of the spoken word. Okay, so those four things. Make sure you keep that in mind. We then talked about how we know that writing and speaking are artificial because they differ among men. They're not natural, or everyone would use the same words and written symbols. And then we talked about how the passions of the soul, Aristotle argues, they actually are the same among all men. And he says that's not the topic of this discussion. And then he talks about how truth is formed by the joining or separating of things. On this last page of the first chapter, the false and the true are conversant with composition and division. If there's anything to take away from this first chapter, it's the understanding of that sentence. The false and the true are conversant with composition and division. Do you understand what that means? If you don't understand what that means, watch this video again. And if you can't figure it out, then get in touch with me, because understanding that sentence is the whole point of this first chapter and of this whole book on interpretation. The false and the true are conversant with composition and division. Make sure you understand that. Nouns and verbs are assimilated to the conception, which is without composition and division, the idea itself, such as man or white. There's no truth or falsehood in these separated ideas or words. Tragelaphos, if we just jam these words together, that doesn't produce truth or falsehood. Only when we join or divide things by the use of is or is not, the verb to be or not to be. Only then do we form truth and falsehood. And we can do that either simply in the present tense or according to time by the use of different tenses in the verb. Okay, so that's the content of chapter 1 of On Interpretation. I hope that's a helpful walk through the first reading. What I advise you to do now is, having listened to that, having walked through that with me this first time, now make your first reading. Sit down and simply read the first chapter. Once you've gone through it by yourself, go through it again and take notes and simply outline the content of that first chapter. And make sure that everything is clear, that you understand every line of this chapter, and then complete the lesson assessment, complete the written assignment, and work to prove that you understand everything in this chapter. If there's anything that you just can't wrap your mind around, you can't understand, and you think even the video, this discussion doesn't explain it well enough, just get in touch and let me know. Remember, asking questions, asking for help is part of being a student. A student is one who seeks knowledge, who seeks to learn. You seek to learn by studying your lesson. You seek to learn by watching this video, but you also seek to learn by asking for help. And if you don't ask for help, you're no longer acting like a student. If you need help, ask for help. When you ask for help, I promise you, you'll find the help that you need. But you have to do the work of a student as one seeking to learn. Okay? So if you have any questions, get in touch. I hope that's a helpful walkthrough. Go read it on your own. Read it again and make an outline. Then complete the lesson assessment. Submit your answers as best you can. I'll review them and let you know how things look. If you have any questions before you do that you don't feel have been answered, get in touch and ask those questions so that I can help you. Okay? Good luck with your studies. I'm looking forward to digging into this second book of Aristotle's Organon as we study on interpretation together. God bless your studies.